Have you ever wondered where modern political thought and theory have come from and how we can change them for the better? Well, just in case you have. Welcome back to another T-Rex Talk. This is Isaac Botkin, and today we're going to be reviewing the book Slaying Leviathan by Dr. Glenn Sunshine, who is a professor of history at the Central Connecticut State University and a senior fellow at the Colson Center for Christian Worldview. Right off the bat, I want you to know that this is a Christian study of political theory. There's lots of other people who have studied and developed political theory who do not come at it from a Christian perspective, and Dr. Glenn Sunshine does so in a very obviously and clearly Christian perspective, and is extremely upfront about that. And this is really important, not only because it's helpful to tell your readers what they're getting into, but also because so much of modern American political theory has come out of Christian churches, Christian philosophers, and even if the people working on some of these political ideas are not Christians themselves, they come out of a Christian world. Western civilization, Christendom, the European experiment, all of that stuff has roots back in a lot of stuff that has happened since, well, I guess we should probably start at the beginning of the book. The beginning of the book talks about the fall of the Roman Empire and the things that grew up out of it. So my recommendation is that you go into this book understanding that it is a history. If there's a quibble that I have with this book, I'm sure that there's several differences of opinion that Glenn Sunshine and I have on random little things, but I have a slight bone to pick with this title. Not that it's a bad title. Slaying Leviathan is a fantastic title. I hope someday to write a book with a title as good as Slaying Leviathan. However, Slaying Leviathan might give you the idea that this book is a how-to guide, that it is a step-by-step list of instructions on how you actually slay Leviathan and then stand over its smoldering corpse. And I guess in one sense that it is. The first step in slaying Leviathan is understanding how we got Leviathan, where Leviathan came from. And so that is what this book does. That is what this book is. It is a historical exploration of where these ideas came from, how they were developed, and a lot of times the most important thing is what they are a reaction to, because you can see, and it's very clear in this book, the way that a pendulum swings from one political theory to another based on things that happen to people in countries, and it drives them to attempt another experiment, to try another way, to build a slightly different political bit of infrastructure, to set up a new way of doing laws, etc. Sometimes it feels like that's the way that things are going. But there is an idea that is promulgated in, I would say, modern circles, that we have slowly ascended one rung at a time. We're going up the staircase. Progressivism is the correct direction, and it's always upwards and onwards and forwards and etc. And when you understand the history that it is, not that carefully planned out, it is a lot more like a chaotic pinball game than anything else. So this book, Slaying Leviathan, was published in the year 2020. A pretty good year to publish a book on unwinding large and unassailable political institutions that are so big, that are so huge, that it's hard to even contemplate the extent of their reach, let alone how you would slay them, or at least, whittle them down to size. And I know this is a topic that he has studied for some time. I met Glenn Sunshine at a conference in 2020, and this was on a lot of people's minds. It was sort of, I think that the timing was about September of 2020. There were a lot of things that had happened by September. There were a lot of lockdowns that had happened. A lot of people had been told that they couldn't travel. This was worldwide, but even in the States, there had been a lot of limitations placed on people doing some activities. And then there had also been a lot of praise, pretty much unbridled praise for people who disobeyed all of those rules if they were doing it for particular political protests, fiery but peaceful protests. So there were a lot of people who were beginning to question the political theory that we were utilizing at the time in the United States, let alone other parts of the country. So let's get started on this book. I want to go through just kind of the chapters And I do recommend this book. This is not a book that is fun to poke holes in, even though, man, the title just makes me wish this book were longer and had step-by-step instructions in it. But there's a lot of I probably should not connect these two dots. There's a lot of great insurgency manuals that have been written by various institutions, which have more step-by-step things in them, if that's really what you're looking for. But this is a fascinating book for understanding the history, and it's short and it's simple. It's less than 200 pages long. It's a very easy read, and I actually find that as much as I like to dig super deep into a specific topic, my brain is usually better served by something that is simpler and faster so that I can get the big picture, so that I can actually understand the context. I can no longer read tens or hundreds of thousands of pages of nitty-gritty stuff and then build that bigger context myself. I'm not sure if I ever could, but it's certainly something that I am not great at doing now. And I think that is something that Glenn Sunshine is great at doing. And he begins the book by talking about the revolution in France, which is fascinating to study as it follows right on the heels of the American Revolution. And they have a lot of the same complaints, and they have a lot of the same goals, but they go about pursuing freedom in almost exactly the opposite way that the Americans did. And they got almost exactly the opposite fruit from their efforts. And there's a bunch of ways in which Americans instituted a republic, which we now call a democracy. The French instituted a democracy, which they called a republic. There are many ways in which there are opposite things being done, opposite things being claimed. But it's worth looking at those two events because they happen so close in time. They share so much rhetoric. They even share a few rhetoricians. Guys like Thomas Paine worked very hard on both revolutions. And yet they are such different animals. So that is an interesting one to look at. But he goes all the way back to the fall of the Roman Empire, the first 300 years of Christian civilization after that. And what was it that Constantine was doing, and what was it that these different nations were doing that were emerging from Rome? What was it that Augustine was doing? Augustine really starts off this idea of what is a Christian nation with a book called The City of God. Now, at this point, I should pause and say, is this a terrifying Christian nationalist book? I don't know. It depends on who you ask. As we've talked about Christian nationalism in the past on the show, if you are a Christian and you live in a nation, that's enough for certain people on CNN to call you one. So by that definition, yes, St. Augustine, terrifying Christian nationalist, right-wing extremist, etc. But The City of God is about much more than that, but it definitely touches on our relationship to earthly institutions like cities and their rulers and their magistrates. And this is something that is incredibly influential, and it sort of ties into Aristotle. Aristotle had a book called Politics. Now, obviously, Aristotle was a moron, just like Plato and Socrates, but that book that he wrote on politics, called Politics, had a pretty massive influence on the Middle Ages as well. And it's very hard to find people who will talk about both of these things in a single book, let alone in a couple of different chapters. This is a book that does that, and I think that that is great. Talking about the different ways, the different pieces that people pulled from Aristotle, the different pieces that people pulled from Augustine, the way that they applied those to different societies that were, at first, coming out of the Roman Empire and trying to figure out how to be countries. But then, as they grew, finding themselves fairly large and fairly flourishing with a lot of different neighbors and a lot of different political thoughts coming out of the Christianization of Northern Europe. And I also just appreciate the way that Sunshine handles some of these things. He just breaks down and explains, Aristotle's three basic forms of government. Rule by a single individual, which starts out as a monarchy, which sounds nice, and then eventually degrades into a tyranny. Or rule by a few people, which starts out as an aristocracy, which starts out nice, and then devolves into an oligarchy. Or rule by many, which always starts out as a republic, which is principled and nice, and devolves into a democracy where there's just mob rule and whatever the people want is what happens. Whatever the majority wants is what happens. The way that he breaks these apart and talks about the way that different parts of these were applied and the reactions to these is really important. Now, as I've said, this is a pretty overtly, pretty deliberately Christian take on this. But I believe that that is absolutely necessary for understanding these time periods. The early Middle Ages, and then later on into right up until, say, the 16, 17, 1800s, there is so much Christian thought in the ruling nations, the leading nations in the world, that it is impossible to understand where some of these ideas came from, how they were applied, even understanding how some of these ideas were rebelled against by the secularists really requires that you have some level of Christian understanding. To ignore Augustine, to ignore everything that came before, to ignore where the ideas of the Magna Carta came from, is to just miss not just important pieces, but I would say the foundations of the political thought that we have today. Even the people that wanted to do a 180 from that still used that as their thing that they were doing a 180 from. And so it is impossible to describe modern political thought in the 21st century without understanding some of this stuff. And I appreciate that there is a Christian writer who is willing to take that stuff on, because I've read political theory from a whole bunch of secularists who just ignore, again, not pieces, but what I would consider to be foundational stuff, simply because it's religious. A perfect example of this would be the Protestant Reformation. A lot of political and historical books kind of skim over this era of history because it's just a religious movement. But there is so much more to it than that. And religious movements have massive implications in other areas. And so what you see happening in the 1500s is a massive political change that comes out of this admittedly religious movement. Church reform in Europe had a massive effect on political thought because the Catholic Church of the time had so much political power. And a lot of us know this. We know this in really simple, basic ways. Like we know that Henry VIII wanted a divorce so that he could marry a wife who would give him an heir. And when the Pope wouldn't give him that, that was his reason to pull away from the Catholic Church so that he could get the heir that he wanted, or at least, another shot at it. But there's more stuff going on. And Henry VIII is not a great example of what I would call a careful reformer. He was definitely a guy who saw an opportunity and he took it. But it's more than just the wife. You got to remember that the Catholic Church owns a huge amount of the land in England at this time. Gigantic churches, huge monasteries, and just an unbelievable amount of physical land. And so when Henry VIII does this marvelous principled thing, when he stands up to protect the church, become the protector of the British church, the head of the Church of England, he is allowing himself, yes, not just a new title, which is pretty spiffy, not just a shot at a new heir that he wants, but it also allows him to grab just hundreds of thousands of acres of land and giant powerful central building. So yeah, a huge amount of political stuff happens in the midst of this religious change. And like I said, a lot of political change is a reaction to previous political changes and previous political experiments, failed and otherwise. And so things like the German Peasants' Revolt drastically changed the way that people think about these political ideas moving forwards. And it is out of the Reformation, essentially, that we get Thomas Hobbes. And Thomas Hobbes is the guy who wrote the book Leviathan, which is, what this book is kind of about. Now, he doesn't show up till partway through the book because you need the backstory. And I want you to read this book for yourself. But if you don't know Thomas Hobbes, he has nothing to do with Calvin and Hobbes, except it's a fun name. To pit Calvin and Hobbes against one another in history is good history. To have Calvin and Hobbes be friends in a children's comic strip is kind of great. But Thomas Hobbes is not just a random political thinker who writes the book Leviathan in a vacuum. He is the personal tutor of Charles II. Charles I is a king who is deposed and then beheaded by reformers, Christian reformers, Puritans in England, who say that he is a tyrant king. They fight a war against his soldiers, they put him on trial, they execute him, and they build a much more decentralized, they should have built a much more decentralized government. They built a somewhat less centralized government. And Charles I's son was in exile in France for a while under the teaching of Thomas Hobbes. And Thomas Hobbes wrote the book Leviathan, in which he proposes a new political thought, a new political theory, which is basically giving people who are common people too much power is a problem. It only results in unrest and things like Charles I getting his head cut off. We need to go back to the divine right of kings, but without the divine part. We need an excuse for kings to be sovereign and all-powerful and unquestionable without relying on the religious stuff, because these religious reformers are able to make the case from Scripture that this is not tenable and this is not right. They've had a couple of hundred years of reading their own Bibles. They've had a couple of hundred years of resisting tyrants in different countries, and so we must have a secular argument that puts the king on a completely unassailable government position of infallibility. Like I said, all these ideas are reactions to stuff. The Pope has been removed from political infallibility by the early stages of the Reformation, and now we have kings like Charles I removed from a throne of political infallibility by the will of the people and the rules of law. I have a lot of thoughts about the English Civil War. I have a book recommendation for those of you that want to get deeper into it. But let's just stick with Slaying Leviathan for now, because it is a fantastic introduction to this. And I've read a lot of people who are commenting on Leviathan. And some people are very complimentary toward Hobbes, because he took that necessary first step of taking political theory away from the people and away from historical tradition, and especially away from religious tradition, and make it its own thing. And I've even read people who have said that Thomas Hobbes was the most influential thinker, the most influential Enlightenment political philosopher in the United States. But it's not Hobbes. It is, in fact, Calvin. Hobbes wrote Leviathan, a book that describes the state being the Leviathan, a creature that is so big that it cannot be killed or taken, a creature that is made up of bringing many things together into this completely unassailable, completely irremovable force, which, the word Leviathan also suggests not good. Not a good force. But this is his idea. And the ideas that are in the book on how you build that and what it does and the way that it runs itself and the way that it has bureaucratic powers and the way that it has its organization. And my contention is that the founders of the United States were not positively, anyway, affected by this book, because they went out of their way to do the exact opposite, to build a system that was decentralized, power was spread out, and there were limits on the state. Leviathan proposes essentially an unlimited state. And even though this book is pretty short, pretty simple, it is fairly entry-level introductory stuff, I do appreciate that there are ways that Dr. Sunshine gets deeper into what Hobbes was thinking than some of the other commenters. Like he mentions, and it is on the cover of this book, he mentions that the front piece of Thomas Hobbes' original publication of Leviathan is a drawing that is telling. It is a drawing of Leviathan itself. And what it is a huge figure, a gigantic figure standing, looming over the countryside, looming over the towns and the farms. It is a figure that is made up of hundreds of tiny, tiny men. But they are all looking inwards. They are all looking only at the state itself. And then the head of this huge figure made up of hundreds of little tiny people is the king's head. It is the only head that is looking out. He is huge. He towers over everything. He looms over everything. He is implacable. He looks slightly like Charles II, which I'm sure is a total coincidence. He has a crown and he has a sword. So the imagery that is in this book describing how the king is over all, the government is going to be a massive bureaucracy that does not look at the world, doesn't look at the facts, doesn't look at the state of the nation. It only looks to the king. That in and of itself, that cartoon image, gives you a little bit of a hint at the way that the book goes. Because Thomas Hobbes' Leviathan is a huge book, and it is a slog to read. So definitely read this first before you dive straight into that. But one of the obvious things that comes out of Leviathan at first glance is if the king is correct in everything that he does simply because of his person, then he cannot be a tyrant. Nothing that he does can be tyrannical because it's him that is doing it. And there is no lawful resistance to the king because everything that the king does is, by definition of him being the king, lawful. And Thomas Hobbes does talk about some of the different aspects of the office versus the man, but in some ways they are so joined that it doesn't matter. Whoever is the king is the sovereign. There is no power that is above him. There are no limits to his reach. There is nothing that he cannot do. And he cannot even be questioned. And in Thomas Hobbes' eyes, and in the eyes of a lot of political philosophers, both before and since, this is a very appealing idea. Because if you have the ability for people to question the monarch, the sovereign, the Politburo, whatever the highest form of political power in the land is, then, well, obviously they will. And then you'll have to figure stuff out, and it's going to be messy. Far better if we go for efficiency over correctness, and we just have an unquestionable guy or an unquestionable group who will just get stuff done. And that unquestionable group, well, maybe they'll have disagreements amongst themselves, and then maybe there'll be some stuff that happens with some knives, and then maybe there'll be that one unquestionable guy at the end, and then we'll have the efficiency, and we'll have the confidence. We'll have one thing that we can follow and that we can do, and it'll all be good. This is the way that a lot of stuff has gone. That is the big difference between the French Revolution that happened shortly after the American Revolution, where power was going to be centralized in a single location, and that power was going to be basically unlimited. The Department of Public Safety had the power to execute essentially anyone for anything. They had the power to rewrite the calendar. They had the power to change even time itself, was the implication of rewriting the calendar and changing all of the clocks. The power of that unassailable and unquestionable government was supposed to be the answer to all of these squabbling and all of the questioning and all of the messiness of the decentralized power that we'd had before. The church claims that there is a God that rules in the affairs of men and is over the king. Well, that's just messy. That's just complicated. And oftentimes the king wants to do stuff that the priests don't want him to, that the Bible doesn't want him to, or whatever. So we'll just sort of move that out of the way. And you can see this pinball kind of going back and forth, or the pendulum swinging back and forth between these different ideas as different things happen. It even happened in the 20th century. Now, in the 1800s, a lot of people recognized that the French Revolution hadn't gone so well, or at least that it hadn't borne the kind of fruit that they wanted. It hadn't created the kind of regime that they wanted to live under. But still, these modern ideas were rolling along and people were trying to apply them in different ways. There was a little bit of a backlash. The pendulum swung this way. The pinballs bounced around a little bit. And you see Britain rising in power and regaining a little bit of its Christian thought. Even after Charles II returns to the throne, puts Thomas Hobbes into a position of great authority and really cracks down on a bunch of the Christian Puritans who had put his father on trial. Even after that, the pendulum swings back a little bit in this direction. And then as the 1800s continue to develop, you see a movement towards more secularized modern nations, more scientifically organized nations. The modern nation state really emerges in the 1800s. And one of the things that happens from a political theory perspective is they try to get away from natural law. Because natural law, even though it's not biblical law, it still implies that you're going to glean things about nature's God from nature's laws, which is exactly what Thomas Jefferson wrote. We will look at the laws of nature and nature's God. And there was a movement away from this into positive law. Positive law theory basically says that the legitimacy of a law comes from the process of making the law. If that unassailable king or Politburo or whatever makes the law, then the law is just, simply by how it was created. Positive law theory was the cool new thing by which you got legitimacy for your state throughout the 20th century. Until something happened. Something happened in the middle of the 20th century, and we wanted to put Nazi Germany on trial for crimes against humanity. And the problem is there's nobody better at positive law theory and making legislative changes and documenting them correctly, than the Germans. And so the Nuremberg trial required that we go back to natural law theory in order for there to be some sort of standard by which we could hold the Nazis accountable for all the stuff that they did. Positive law theory had to go away for a while simply so that we could do the thing we wanted to do and recognize that somehow there is a higher standard. Somehow democratically elected rulers of countries who cross all the T's and dot all the I's and keep all the minutes and record all the votes and actually do all the positive law stuff still have limits. Now, the Nuremberg trials didn't get really deep into political theory, but that idea was necessary so that the Nuremberg trials could happen in the first place. And now we've kind of swung the pendulum a little bit back the other way in the 21st century to where there needs to be a large, powerful, implacable state, and the only place that it really needs to go for permission is maybe a group of other states, like the United Nations or NATO or something like that. Something like that would be enough. The Watchmen could be watched by other watchmen. That will be okay. And there's been a lot of talk about democracy. Although, interestingly, as I am recording this particular episode, there are some interesting elections happening in Europe. There's a groundswell of support for what the media calls far-right populists. People are voting for the wrong people. Even after all this talk about democracy, the will of the people, whatever the people want is correct. The will of the people is the will of God. Oh, no, we don't say that anymore. The will of the people is the direction that the nation should take. Populism is still somehow bad. If there is a candidate and his credentials are that people like him better, that's somehow not okay. So we're back to Leviathan. There has to be this large, implacable, intractable, unmovable, unquestionable entity, this thing, this huge deep state, should I say? A large bureaucracy of men who just by sheer power and procedure and positive law capability make themselves unassailable. This thing has to be so big that it cannot be opposed, dismantled into tiny pieces that are questionable. And whether it has a king at its head or whether it has something else at its head, the Leviathan is the answer to all of this squabbling, says Thomas Hobbes, and says globalists, various globalists. So now is a great time to read this book. It's a perfect time for you to have a better understanding of the history of some of these political theories, the way that this political thought has developed, where the pinball has been bouncing in the past. I don't know that it will necessarily give you an idea of where the ball will bounce next, but I would put it to you that it's not your responsibility to sit and watch the pinball. I think that it is your responsibility to stand up and get involved in the process. This is the exact opposite of what Thomas Hobbes wrote. Thomas Hobbes wrote that everybody goes the direction that the head of Leviathan takes it, and only those people who are part of the large, implacable combined scales of the Leviathan get to be part of the nation directing course, whatever. That is the exact opposite of what I believe. That is the exact opposite of what the Reformers and Augustine and men of the Christian tradition believe. They believe that if you are a human being on planet Earth, you don't have to be the king. You don't have to be a nobleman. You don't have to be a democratically appointed voter or a member of the bureaucracy. You have responsibilities to your family, to your neighbors, and to your nation. A lot of political theorists over time have disagreed with me, but this is my position, and I'm sticking to it.